All right, we'll go ahead and get started. I'm Dreama Gentry. Today I'm joined by Darryl Lester and Rosa Moreno. It's great to have this conversation because Darryl and Rosa have been right there with us here as we've done our AmeriCorps journey and really worked to bring and embed AmeriCorps into our college access work in Kentucky. So when I started thinking about college access and how AmeriCorps, especially during this time, this pandemic time, can actually help us do our work. These were the two folks that I wanted to invite to join us. Today, we're going to explore a little bit about how AmeriCorps can be used and how college access programs, particularly those of us in rural places, may want to think about leveraging service year programs like AmeriCorps to accelerate our outcomes and to support the work. So I'll start with Darryl. Welcome, Darryl. You're muted, so you got to unmute yourself. I'm going to say that now before I have to say it again. All right. Good morning, Darryl.
Good morning. Good morning, all. Hope everybody is well on the call.
And Darryl, our work here is really, the folks do work in college access in rural places. So does rural resonate with you? Do you have experience with rural? Tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, more ways than one. I was raised in rural South Carolina, a little place called Marion. A lot of folks only heard about it because on the way to Myrtle Beach, when there was no bypass, they had to go right through Marion. And so the one Hardys stayed afloat because of the beach traffic. And it also was a place of employment for a lot of young folks in Marion. And so that is where I credit a lot of stuff that I learned from growing up in Marion. Still go back to Marion to try to figure out opportunities for young people that live in Marion. So that's what my heart is. And, I spent, a lot of time in higher ed, but was also trying to get young folks to think about how they use their time and talent in a way that benefits sometimes communities that sometimes only a few blocks outside of their university. And then being in a state like North Carolina that has mountains on one side and you go the other side and you got the coast. And so you have rural spaces that are located in the western part of the state. And then you have rural places in the eastern part of the state, which really makes for an interesting playground to be able to engage folks. And so being able to spend time in that space and then being also involved in service years, got connected to Public Allies and it was getting started in Durham, North Carolina. And so that's where I got incubated of looking at how you bring in young people who come into a space and one may have a GED and one may have a PhD sitting in the same room talking about service and figuring out as a core how they make a collective impact. So that is what has shaped my lens. And I'm just glad to be a part of the conversation, and being sitting at NC State University and the Institute for Emerging Issues gives me a platform on which to engage in this work. So I'm thankful for that. So just glad to be a part of the conversation. Glad to be here with you and then with Rosa.
Great. Glad to have you. And Rosa, I think we first met back when the Department of Ed partnered with CNCS to do AmeriCorps school turnaround grants. And Berea College was one of the grantees. And honestly, we knew a lot about education, but really very little about AmeriCorps. It was our first step in. And you were on that team that really helped us think about how AmeriCorps could accelerate our work. But what about you? How does rural resonate with you? What's your experiences?
Great. Good afternoon, morning, everyone. I'm pleased to join this conversation. For me, like Darryl, I was born and raised in a rural community in an unincorporated town in Southeast Arizona. I used to pride myself because I would say that my town had the only 2 streetlights in all of the county, and it felt like a really big deal. But for me, like Darryl said, the special characteristics, the richness, the unique sense of community that I think you find in rural communities is really important. The other part I'm really interested about this conversation and what we're talking about today is the focus on education and the potential for national service to be a resource. For me, I am a former middle school teacher. I taught 8th grade in a rural community. And in that place, I really felt like as a middle school teacher, I really was focused on talking about college access from day one. I remember doing an exercise for my kids who they, of course, all wanted to buy cars. So I had them do research on what the price of a car was, what the cost of a loan was, and what their monthly payment was. And then I had them do a similar exercise for college, and some of the aha moments that it meant. And that was because for my students from a rural community, college seemed like something that wasn't for them. And we had some good employers in our town. So for most of them, they thought maybe that would be their first step. So for me, college access as a middle school teacher in a rural community was a strong message that I really wanted to share. And then I also, as a former AmeriCorps member, early on, right after I graduated from college, I served as an AmeriCorps member in Texas, and I was a bilingual literacy tutor, again, trying to really focus on how we can make sure that students were on track to succeed, which is part of that pathway to making sure we're ready and prepared. And then finally, Dreamer, I like that you brought up the connection, our first connection. I have spent the majority of my career working with communities and organizations to identify ways that national service can be a strategy for them to achieve their goals, and things like generating partnerships and helping people come in and find ways to become an AmeriCorps program and use this asset has been something that I've been dedicating my time to. So I'm hoping that I can impart some resources and equip folks here to start to think about how they could make that happen in their own communities.
And I do think that it's important to hear from you all and the experiences of where AmeriCorps works in rural places, because often I find that organizations, college access programs in rural areas sort of think that AmeriCorps is not for them, that it fits more in an urban environment. And honestly, that's what we thought about back until we got into it. And then once we were into it, we realized that not only could AmeriCorps help those students that were working with college access, but all of our members, we have close to 100 members, they're all actually residents of our rural place. And so it actually can be a stepping stone for residents of all ages to get back into the education pipeline and the career pipeline. And so I think as we talk today and as folks are thinking about AmeriCorps today, I want to make sure we're thinking about it from both sides, that AmeriCorps is all about moving the outcomes, but it's also about providing residents with opportunity to serve. And Darryl, you're wanting to say something. I can just see that. You're muted, Darryl. Okay.
Well, it was something that Rosa said too. It was that if somebody didn't come in, and it was mainly in my time, my parents that kind of just planted the seed around, hey, think about college, just go to college. And I had people in my hometown that said, hey, and so I got that message. But when you started talking about that inside out approach around it being folks that live in the place, in the space, that could also serve, and that it's like we flip the narrative on it, that we have assets within that could bring, to me, a lot of gifts and talents to the spaces they live in, to help other folks. So I get excited about that. I start jumping up and down about that, because I think that if we can add to the stories of folks that sometimes come in, to the folks that come from the inside out, I'm excited about those collective stories within that. So I was excited about that. So I was just, I didn't mean to make it so obvious, but I just had to, when Rosa was talking about what she was saying and what you said, I'm excited about that because I'm a product of rural.
Yeah, and I do think that that's one of the ways that this can transform communities. I also, we're paying attention to the federal landscape, and there is some legislation to try to expand AmeriCorps, but also to expand or to increase the living allowance for AmeriCorps. We've really been following that because we do think that AmeriCorps needs to have a larger living allowance so that low-income first-generation students could actually have that opportunity to serve. So it is another piece to think about. So before we go into that, and I want us to circle back to that conversation at the end, but let's sort of level set. And so Rosa, can you share with us some information just about AmeriCorps in case, I know some of the folks on the call are familiar, but others are not.
Great, glad to do that. What I wanted to do is share a screen really quickly. Hopefully you all can see this. So many of us on this call and other leaders around the country are tirelessly working to provide quality education to students. And that's something that most of you all on the call do day in and day out. But I wanted to share a few facts here, because I think what surprises me is that oftentimes many people don't realize the number of organizations and communities that are benefiting from national service in the education space. And sometimes it's an aha moment. And I share this mostly because I want to point out that for AmeriCorps, education is one of the largest areas of investment. I think they'll often tout themselves as being like second to something like Department of Ed, or if you think about federal sources. So I wanted to point out a few things here for you. And first and foremost, that more than 44,000 national service participants are serving in school and out of school, supporting at-risk youth. And this is yearly. You can see here that's in about 12,000 schools, 1 out of every 4 low-performing schools, and 1 out of every 10 charter schools. So I think this, for me, is an interesting point of reference, because it speaks to the reach and the depth. And these are at schools of both urban and rural locations. I want to go to the next slide. And what I wanted to talk about here really is in the ways in which national service is engaging. So AmeriCorps plays a role in helping these communities provide results-driven, cost-effective solutions. And across the nation, AmeriCorps programs are engaging at different stages of a student's academic journey. So from the cradle to career. So for those of you on the phone, I'm sure you cover the breadth of all of this. And the things that are listed here, what I want to point is that many of this are, over the course of the history of AmeriCorps, there's been a focus on collecting evidence basis for the work that's happening. So rigorous independent evaluations have demonstrated that AmeriCorps programs improve school readiness, increase reading and math achievement, improve school attendance and behavior, and increase access to college and careers. The slide that I've listed here are just some specific goals and outcomes that many AmeriCorps programs are tracking on. And the reason I share this here is because when I'm talking to organizations around thinking about like, is this for me, or can this be helpful? I always first ask to say, like, if when you ask yourself, what's the challenge facing you and your students and the goals that you're working on shows up on this list, then I hope that you come to see AmeriCorps as part of that solution. Because as you can see here, the breadth is pretty expansive. And so this is, context to help you give that and see yourself in that. And before I can share a few more things, I wanted to talk about ways that you can leverage. So, right, hopefully I've piqued your interest. You're starting to ask yourself, how can I leverage AmeriCorps? You heard, I saw, or at least on the chat box, a number of probably participants saying they are running AmeriCorps programs. We heard of at least 2, the Arizona, the Vermont. There have been a couple of people who've posted that said that they've served as AmeriCorps members. So already on the phone call, we have some experts. And so what I wanted to do is just leave you with ways you could engage. So obviously is that you could apply directly for AmeriCorps funding. For programs that are thinking about doing this, I always say, like, look, there's other programs happening, so be inspired by the existing program models. If you're going to consider applying, think about what you need and figure out who else is doing this and what can you learn from them. But you could apply directly, or you could partner to apply. So, right, maybe a collaborative if you need, feel like you'd be stronger together, or that it's going to be more beneficial to you, then pull together a couple of people and apply what as I call an intermediary, which is one of you's the lead, and you could collaborate together, or be a host site. Sometimes many AmeriCorps programs are already operating in communities and are looking for schools or other organizations, community-based organizations to partner with, and in that case you can be a host site. So these are 3 things. And if you specifically are wondering if you're eligible, because that's something that people come up, right? Like Dreama said, first and foremost, the first thing we do is sometimes we're really good at telling ourselves no, right? It's not for us. And that voice comes on and we convince ourselves it's not for us. And I always tell folks, before you go there, just do your due diligence. And then maybe you might get to know it's not for me. And that's a totally fair answer. Otherwise, to think about it. So from an eligibility standpoint, most everyone that is going to be eligible. If you're a school, a local education agency, a state education agency, a nonprofit, state or local government, a university, a college, a tribal nation, then yes, you're eligible to apply. And I probably didn't even cover everyone. So please know that. But, you know, like I said, these are some things that you'd be, could do if you want to proceed. And what I want to do is, before I hang up, I want to just point out there are two entities that over the course of our call we're probably going to reference. For those of you who are familiar with national service, these entities are not going to be new to you, but for those of you that are kind of like, who are you talking about and what are you talking about, I just want to make sure I cover them, because as we're conversing, they're probably going to come up. And the first one is the Corporation for National Community Service, which you're going to hear us call them CNCS. And this is the independent federal agency that administers AmeriCorps. The next entity that you're going to hear us talk a lot about is this thing called a State Service Commission. Why they are important is that 2/3 of the funds at the federal level are administered at the state level. And these agencies, these state service commissions, are the entities within a state that function in that role. So with a few exceptions, I'm going to say there's like just a handful of them, your state is going to have some entity or agency that is serving as the State Service Commission. So we'll talk about that through the later, but for now I'll pause there, kick it back to you, Dreama, to go ahead and engage us in conversation, but I wanted to set that context for now.
That's really helpful. One of the things that sort of struck me as you were talking is, I know a lot of the folks, when I look at who's on those that sort of piped up and told us where they were from and what organization, they may be Gear Up folks, or they may have TRIO programs, or they may be doing the college access work through federal grant programs. So Rosa, when they think about an AmeriCorps, which does require a match, and it actually requires real dollars in match, can federal programs and grants be used to match AmeriCorps? Can they work hand in hand?
Yes, so when it comes to managing federal grants and utilizing federal funds as match, the rules are always different. So each federal program will have to define if it's allowable or not. For AmeriCorps, AmeriCorps does allow for federal funds to be used as match. The only hitch is that the federal agency that's going to have their funds used as matched has to have designated that as allowable. And I should have looked this up before I got on this call. Department of Ed fundings, there is a large amount of ed funding that the Department of Ed allows as federal match. So many education programs, a lot that I talked about, they are using federal funds that have gone to local, state, or local school districts as match, or including institutions of higher ed. And off the top of my head, I'm not recalling if TRIO is, so maybe you or even someone else on the call may already know the answer to that question.
And what we've found is, I know through the years that we've done AmeriCorps, there have been times where we wanted to use our Gear Up dollars. I can't remember if we wanted to use TRIO dollars, but I know we use Gear Up dollars. And it was a conversation with the program officer to get that permission. And then I think in one of our Gear Up programs, we actually wrote it into the actual grant. So it actually was a core part. And so I would encourage folks that are thinking about AmeriCorps and the match dollars is holding you back to think about all your funding streams, because CNCS is one of those few places where federal money can match if you have that permission. So I appreciate that sort of overview. If folks have specific questions, enter them into the chat. And Darryl, anything you want to add to tie in that resonated with you when Rosa went through those charts, those slides? And I know you work with organizations that have never done AmeriCorps to get people to start thinking about it.
Yeah, I think if we can continue to demystify what it is for folks, I think that the more the merrier, so that folks understand and they don't self-select out. They say, well, that's not for me, I can't do that, or we're not large enough. I think giving them all of the information and then let them self-select is always good. So I'm always figuring out ways to raise the visibility of a service year by either having a young person to tell their story, or having a host organization who may have been a recipient of maybe a VISTA or AmeriCorps to talk about what it meant for their organizations. And we're fortunate in North Carolina where we've had some organizations that serve in rural communities who have used the kind of services as a pipeline to diversify their staff. So they found that level of diversity coming in through that service year lane, and that some of those folks went on to become staff members. And so listening to the permanent staff folks talk about what it meant was very powerful to other organizations, especially in the times we live in now, where people are looking at doing a little bit more to making that pool look a little bit more diverse. That could be one avenue that they look at bringing diversity into their organization and giving them a sense of here's what the lay of the land is.
And I'll speak for our experience in Kentucky. We've got school districts in our rural places that are having difficulty filling teacher positions. And what we've seen after being in some of these school districts for close to 10 years is that our AmeriCorps members, we require 2 years of college, or at least enough hours to equal 2 years of college. But we've had members who complete their degree while they're serving, but then after their 2 years of service, they've actually been employed by the school district. And so we've got school districts who really, have many folks, from a school psychologist to a math teacher to a guidance counselor, that actually came through the AmeriCorps program. So I think that talent development aspect, especially, most of ours are residents, right? But I also like that idea of ways to get diverse folks into your organizations. So I think that talent development pipeline is key.
Yeah, and I was going to echo that a little bit. I know, Jeremy, you asked us, one of the questions you asked us to reflect on in preparation for this is like, what is the benefit to the individual doing the service, and how does the host site, and besides, of course, the fact that the members placed in a school to actually deliver a set of results or goals, the thing that you all are pointing out is that secondary, like unintended benefit, that I will say to you is actually, when you talk to folks, is a very, very common thing, to the point that many programs have to write into their agreements with their host sites not to poach the member, in particular because they have this opportunity to get an individual who's going to commit. It's kind of like you hire somebody, but without the commitment, it's like a trial run. And because of the kind of talent that people are bringing in, and the development and the coaching and the time and effort that programs are putting into AmeriCorps members, like these are individuals who then develop this cultivate and commitment to a mission and a cause, and they're developing skills and they're getting real hands-on experience, that this is very attractive to the host sites, that it is very common. You will find lots of programs where they're like, yep, you're going to see tons of AmeriCorps alumni in the institution. So I like that. And then I want to come back because I think this diversity thing has been a really important thing. When Dreama, you talked about school turnaround program, which is the Department of Ed program that we had at the Corporation for National Community Service had. But prior to, one of the predecessor initiatives was FEMA Corps. And just so that you all know, for those of you, FEMA had been working with AmeriCorps for many, many years, to the point where they were like, how can we just become a permanent full-time partner? They intentionally made an investment of federal funds to self-fund an AmeriCorps program. And their biggest reason was that FEMA was aging, and the employees at FEMA did not look like the rest of America. So they intentionally were attractive by in this case, the program that they were going to try to fund was a youth corps. So there was age bound, which meant they were all young. And secondly, the program was very diverse. And for that reason, besides that was almost the leading reason why they chose to do that, was because it was going to bring in a whole new pipeline to be introduced to their work. And it was going to add to the richness that they were seeking. So I think that was a very good point, Darryl. And I think subsequent to that, many programs talk about that, especially to the extent that it adds, and teacher core programs, like you pointed out, Dream, was a very common one.
And I think, our focus here is really looking at that educational programs or the college access programs, but we know that too many of our young people don't make it through high school, or they don't make it right into post-secondary ed. So I know there's also programs for what you would call opportunity youth or disconnected youth. If folks are interested in that, is there some programs they should research, or some things they should be aware of there?
Yeah, so I think in the end, I think there are lots. So I would think would be helpful at the end, and I know we'll share contact information, is think about what you're doing. So some very well-known models are youth build. Most people are familiar with the youth build model. This is a model where you think about the student who's not on mainstream path to complete school, right? They either dropped out or they didn't finish. So youth build provides them an opportunity to earn their GED while doing hands-on work. In this case, mostly building homes. In some cases, Youth Build has some other models where they're doing other type of work like nursing, and I've seen one where they're doing some computer and tech type of things. So that is a very common one. There are programs like a model. Both of the ones I'm about to share are urban, but they probably could work in any setting. It's called PowerCorps Camden, PowerCorps PHL. In that situation, the young person comes in, they work on projects that are partnering with city departments, specifically Parks and Rec, and with the water department. Their program, though, you have to come in with the high school education because they don't do GED development, but they're really talking to kids who are maybe in probation, maybe they're not ready, college ready. Maybe they want to get a job, apply for work, but because maybe school's not for them, but they don't have the experience. So they really are very, very intentional. They say from the get-go, the measure of success is where the young person's going to be 12 months after they leave their program. That's what they're holding themselves to. So the young person does 4 months of a program. Then they transition to what they call a phase 2, and phase 2 is like is a workforce development program. They're partnering with employers. They might be partnering with community-based, but the young person is getting a lot of professional development. And again, they're focused on, the younger age group, 18 to 28. But there are a number of trying to say okay, these kids aren't the mainstream. They're not going directly from school to college. They're maybe looking at alternatives. And so this is kind of something that they're doing.
Yeah, I think I'm glad that Rosa brought that up, because this notion of how we change people's perception of young people who we think are takers and flip the script on them, and now you see them as producers. They're now serving, and I think giving them the opportunity to use their creative skills in a different space is so important. So it's almost like soft power allows them to say, when you see, so if you had a core of young men of color and they're now serving in community, subtly that begins to move people's perception of how they see them. And I think service can begin to do that. When I was at Public Allies, we used to always toy with this concept of having a core of young men of color, and what it would mean for the nonprofit sector if you took those young men and you were placing them in nonprofits who historically had never really had a young man of color in their segment, and how that could begin to onboard some really good long-term development for the pipeline. So I think being able to flip it and get them serving can change sometimes people's perception of how they're seen in communities. And so when we have opportunity youth, I get excited that, hearing stories of a young man that says, hey, I was in front of the judge and the judge was getting ready to send me away, and because of this service path, I was able to turn my life around. That's an exciting story.
And it's interesting that you're mentioning young men, because in our work here in Eastern Kentucky, and then even as Berea College, when we look at our data, it's the young men that are failing to launch after high school, right? And so our region, I think in our congressional district, it's around 25% of young people, 18 to 24, are not working and not in school. And when we look at that, that's a large percentage of young men. And in our region, it's young white men. And so we've been toying with this idea of, could a year of service, like a conservation corps, a FEMA corps, a youth build, where they could find their success, get them back on that route. So I think that all of us who do college access, we have to think about those kids who don't transition immediately to post-secondary and make sure that they have opportunities too. So those ideas are powerful. But just being realistic and thinking about us doing work in rural places. And Rosa, you mentioned you had stoplights in your town. We had folks in the chat saying we didn't even have stoplights. And honestly, we didn't even have a town. Like, I lived in the country. There wasn't even a town, right? So if we're thinking about doing an AmeriCorps program, What are some of the barriers that we're going to have to really address, especially if we're a small rural place? Any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think some of the things that I often hear, there are three, but before I answer, I want to give some context. So just to be upfront, there are I think two particular AmeriCorps programs that are probably going to apply to this audience. I've seen some folks talk about them. One is AmeriCorps State National. That's the grant program. And then AmeriCorps Vista. And I've seen on the chat, there have been some people who either served as Vista or had a Vista. I'm going to answer your question from the AmeriCorps State National grant program. And the reason for that is some of the barriers I'm about to share usually come up when talking about that program. Just to point out, the grant program is the largest of the AmeriCorps programs, and it's mostly the one that someone thinks of when they talk about barriers. So that's what I want to give that context. But I'll say there are three things that come to mind for me. One you already hit on, and I'll just kind of offer some additional suggestions, which is the inability to meet the match requirements. Another one is a real or perceived lack of organizational capacity or staff expertise. And then this third one is sentiments or things that I hear where it says AmeriCorps is too complicated. I can't even tell the difference between the programs, which one's a fit for me, where do I even get started, and I'm out. And for that reason, I'm out. But I want to talk a little bit about before just leaving you with like, here's some problems. I want to take some time to share what I think are some strategies and solutions for you all. As I said, the AmeriCorps grant program does require match, but there are multiple ways to achieve that match. And Jeremy, you pointed out a couple already. So first and foremost, the match can be met with cash match, including the federal funds from other federal grants like Dreama pointed out, also in-kind contributions. So my two suggestions I have around this are really to think strategically about how to leverage the assets you already have. As Dreama pointed out, you already had some existing funding resources. Your strategy was to write it into the AmeriCorps as a match into your next grant. You're thinking about what existing resources could we repurpose and apply. So that one is to start thinking creatively. The second thing that I've seen people really do and do really well is to start to engage community stakeholders in identifying funding sources. I've seen communities come together to say, I heard about this resource. I've done some research. I know this is like, what's it going to take for us to bring this to our town? And that creative problem solving has been really interesting. And I mean, Darryl, you might be able to start talking, a little bit about how you're generating that conversation and what happens if you get people to start brainstorming. So if you haven't done that, that's something I would suggest. The other thing I want to point out are a couple things that are unique to rural communities. Just so that you know, AmeriCorps does have a match, but over time the match gets higher. So that at the end of a certain period of time, you're at a dollar for dollar match rate. And I tell people that sometimes their eyes get really big and they're like, wow, that's too much for me. What I want to point out though, is that rural communities can apply for an alternative match requirement. So you may want to consider that as an option. You could start to research what it means. You could see if you're qualified. And so the alternative match requirement paired with the thing is about thinking creatively. The other part I want to leave you with is that rural communities actually qualify to apply for a little higher grant amount than others. So for example, AmeriCorps has a max grant size you could ask for. And I'm not going to get into what that is because there's not enough time to go in through all of that, but just know that there's a max you can ask for. And the max you can ask for is a little higher for rural communities than it is for non-rural. And I think that's important to recognize because then it provides you the financial resources you need to run a program. So I think that's so if you were, asked for a little bit more money and you were able to get your match adjusted down and you were able to bring stakeholders to think about creatively how to leverage your funds, then you can run a program. I said the next one was the real or perceived organizational capacity. I always say to folks, you know what, look, read the instructions, familiarize yourself what the expectations are, and then ask yourself, do you feel confident that you can do this? And if not, why not? Because if not, then I would say to you, consider making a plan to build your capacity. The capacity and effort needed to run and manage a federal grant, the policies and procedures you need, these are good practices for any organization to have. And if you're really committed to your mission and your cause, like getting better and building your capacity to be able to do that is, I would say, good business in general. So, if not, then start to think about how you could build your capacity because in any event, it's a good thing to do. But one thing I'll say on that one is there are oftentimes that there are opportunities for AmeriCorps planning grants. Again, planning grants. And in this situation, what you do is you're not getting a grant to run a program, you're getting a grant to plan for a program. So during this time, you get to be a part of an AmeriCorps network. You're getting to learn a little bit more about the rules and the regulations, but not at the high level of running a full-fledged operating AmeriCorps program. You get to meet other program directors. You're going to get access to the staff of a commission. And so it's really helpful. And then my third barrier was this complicated, right? Where do I start? And so I am going to be the first to always tell people that it is an alphabet soup of programs and terms, and it's hard for people. But what I could say to you is ask questions, connect to others already doing this work. You're going to find that there are people who want to help you. There are entities like Darryl and his team in North Carolina, that's their whole point, is trying to help you navigate and think through how they can grow and bring service to communities. And what Bray is doing today, right, is that the fact that all of you are on the call today is a great example of a solution to this barrier. Because if we don't ask and learn, then it's hard. And I've found in most instances people to be really, really willing and interested in helping, because we're committed to serving communities that are underserved. And for that reason, if learning more about this resource and accessing this resource is going to help you do that, you're amongst friends who really want to see you be successful.
Darryl, anything you want to talk about barriers? And again, if you guys have specific questions, put them in the chat box and we'll get to those. Anything that you want to add to the barrier discussion?
Yeah, I was just jumping up and down over here, listening to Rosa to kind of lay out those pieces. And so in my mind, I was like, Rosa's talking about those really, really good hard skills that people can have. Let's get this right. So my mind also went to the soft pieces around in rural spaces. There is this spirit, this culture, this desire to be in a collective engagement with other people. And I tell folks to lean on that asset. It doesn't always have to be one big organization that carries it. It could be a collaborative piece that says, hey, we want to bring this here. You do your piece, I do my piece. So I think that has always been the lifeblood of rural communities, that people have pooled what they had to make a difference in the world that they wanted to see. And so I think for us, the more, if we can identify in some rural spaces, sometimes that one organization that's perceived to have the capacity, right, is being able to talk to them. And sometimes they are the one where all the resources flow through. And if we can get them to think about how they help other organizations to begin to broaden their capacity, like Rosa was talking about. And then sometimes we have to have a deeper lens. We have to go and look. What we may see may not look like there's anything there, but there's something there. And do we get a little, sometime, I always say, take the risk and say, hey, y'all folks, let's go and, I always say people sometimes self-select out of processes when, hey, go ahead and put it on the table, go through the process. Even if you get denied or something, at least you've gone through the journey. You never know what the outcome is going to be unless you get in the game. So being able to go through the journey a little bit is helpful to organizations. And I'm always saying that for young folks, this notion of community philanthropy in those communities is that people will, when they see the value of something, will figure out a way to support it. So that notion of a cash match or something, sometimes people will it's not about their surplus, but it's about their sacrifice. And they'll say, hey, we will sacrifice because this has benefit to our community, to our space.
Yeah, I think I've been thinking a lot about just that partnering, like, and like you said, Darryl, in rural places, it's natural. But one of the things that's been really neat for us is, as we've done this rural summit that got canceled back in April, which is why we've started these conversations, but we had an opportunity to gather together with people across the country from rural places, is seeing some of those natural partnerships come out. And I really think that there's potential with AmeriCorps. It's not place bound. So there could be organizations that are doing college access work in rural Texas and rural Vermont and rural Washington State that work together to design a program
Yes.
Right. So is there models on that where, that maybe the program is that national focus, but they're doing sort of similar things in each place? Do you all have any suggestions of models that are doing that well that we could look at if we wanted to do something similar with a rural focus?
Well, we have in North Carolina, we have College Advising Corps. So the National College Advising Corps is headquartered in Chapel Hill, but they also have sites across the state that are partnering with colleges. So they are hiring, engaging young folks to work in high schools, sometimes under-resourced high schools, sometimes high schools that could just use a little bit of additional help to get young people over that hurdle to think about college access. And so usually it's a graduate that's fired from that institution that's been out of school at least their first or second year, and they place them in spaces, and all they do is talk to young people about college, whether it's community college, whether it's junior college, and so I love that model, and it also takes some of the burden off the counselor that's in the school who would love to be able to serve all the kids but can't. For us, my colleague Maggie Woods, who's on the line, we're always thinking about those models and how we expand those models to include, in North Carolina, we have a significant amount of HBC, historically black colleges and universities. We also have what we call predominantly minority colleges, which we used to be Pembroke State, is now UNC Pembroke. So when we look at that, we want to make sure that as we're talking about service years, that they're in the center of the conversation, not on the margins. That those young folk that are there are thinking about, hey, you mean at North Carolina A&T State University or North Carolina Central or Elizabeth City State, who is in the rural part of the state, that their young folks are saying, hey, I'm coming out, I can take my time and talent back to a school too. And I might take it back to a school that I came from. So that model is good. And I think we also have Vista intermediaries that are placing young people in rural spaces across the state that are having some really good success, even though they may sit in a well-resourced place, but they're placing in rural spaces and they're providing good support.
Rosa, any other national models that folks should look at, either to connect with and say, hey, can we be part of it, or to look at what a rural version might look like?
Yeah, so the one that Darryl mentioned, of course, is one that I was going to mention. There's also College Possible. College Possible has been replicating, and mostly they've actually had a very interesting national scale strategy that really is trying to think about how to partner specifically with institutions of higher ed. And so that's something that probably want to take a look at. And then there's been I'll say statewide, it's more regional. It's called College Forward. It's in Texas, and it's trying to serve multiple counties in Texas. And all of those I think would be great to look at. The thing I just want to reinforce, I think that Darryl said, and I want to echo it, is Darryl, I liked how you said that adding a college advising corps to a program has helps them maybe do more with what a single counselor could do. One of the things I think that's come about is, and where you started earlier a little bit, is the near peer connection. Many of these programs are attracting people who are closer to age to the young person. And as you said, if they're really focused on attracting diverse young people, or even dream of rural, you said like they're retaining or recruiting locals. And so here you have people who look like me, live like me, are from my own community, who are guiding me. Like there's this added benefit besides just additional capacity to do more. There's just like this unique thing that a young person giving advice might feel different than if I'm giving somebody advice, that I think is a unique piece. But yeah, those are some programs that I think we could highlight that I think are worth looking at.
And I know there's some discussion in the chat around virtual, right? And so I do think that someone mentioned that they were a college advising corps advisor in the College Point program, which actually was a virtual model even before COVID. And I know with our members, we've been able to take them into a virtual service mode. So I do think that the AmeriCorps program seems to be open to thinking of virtual models. And again, if we're thinking of a national program, that would make a lot of sense.
Yeah. And that seems to be, when you talk about kids who serve in an advising role, that seems to be an easy onboard to be able to continue that, even though they're not face to face with the young person that they're advising. I think we're also, most folks are familiar with the Teach for America model. So there sometimes are placed in rural spaces as well. Because I bit the public allies bug a long time ago, this notion of can an ally be placed in a nonprofit that serves in a rural space? The interesting dynamic is because they have that one day a week training component, and they're figuring out, so well, maybe we do that training component virtually. And no, to take into consideration that one ally is serving at the other end of the state. So I think there are models of existing programs that can be slightly adapted to be more intentional, to look at the ability to have impact in rural spaces.
Yeah, and I think there's some good suggestions of programs in the chat. So what we'll do when we post this recording and send the link out is we'll go through the chat and pull down the names of all the programs that are mentioned. So if you've mentioned a program, if you have a website link that you can put in, that would make our job easier. And that way you'll have that resource piece. So as we think about, our thing today is conversations for action, right? It's great to talk about this. It's great but if we want to leave with your all suggestions for action steps. So thinking about college access, success professionals that may work middle school through college in a rural place. What are some things they could do to follow up to explore? And Rosa, I know you have some slides that you want to do. Darryl, you want to go before Rosa's slides or after?
Let me go after Rosa's slides. Yeah, that's how we've been doing this tag team like that. So I like
really
when she
appreciate
leads
Rosa's
off.
slides. They
Yeah,
help.
she
So,
leads
Rosa,
off and I kind of
take it
chime
away.
in.
I like that you gave me the opportunity to do slides, particularly because every time I'm working with a team of folks, I'm like, unless we do something with information, we might as well not waste our time. So yeah. I wrote these down and I want to kind of talk really quickly why I chose them, and hopefully they're things. There are some of you right now who are going to be thinking, I'm ready to go. I'm ready to apply. When's the next deadline? And there's some of you that I'm like, I have no idea what this is. I need to figure this out. And so I was trying to give you some points of reference all along the spectrum. So really quickly, you heard me say that the entity about the State Service Commission, I would say no matter where you are on, hey, I'm ready to apply, or heck, I don't know what this is, I'd contact them. And each of these, I know that you'll post this. I try to provide links so that you could have it. So I'd contact your state commission in your states. You can learn more about their AmeriCorps funding process. You can ask for recent application instructions so you could start to learn more. I would do that. I would find out, you just heard a lot of people who talked about programs in their community that are maybe already doing college access something. I'd find out who's in your program, who's already operating in your state, who's operating in your community, because you could start to make connections. If there's a college access program that's not in your town, but is in your state, then what would it take to get them to come to your town? So here's a link. When you get to this link, there are multiple reports enumerated on the site. I want you to look specifically at the one that's called Service Location Report, because that's going to list programs by city. And this is going to list all the programs that the federal agency funds. So I advise that you focus specifically on the one that says AmeriCorps State and National. You may also want to look at Vista, but for now, that's what I would recommend. Often people ask about successful applications. While the most recent applications aren't posted because it seems to take the federal government a really long time to post things, they do have some from at least 3 years ago. This link will take you to a page that you could go find who applied and who got funded and what's the copy of the application look like. So go read one. Although I'm going to say to you, like, be mindful that I would read a number of them, because you don't want to just read one and think that's the silver bullet. So that's something. For people who are still scared, I say volunteer to serve as a grant reviewer. If you want to know how the sausage is made, go to the factory. So here you could serve as a grant reviewer. You could contact the state commission. You could find out what it's going to take. This is a good way to start to build your knowledge. So I would do that. There are, if you do a Google, sorry, I'm going all over the place. If you do a Google search for readiness assessments, there have been some state service commissions who are trying to help organizations think about if they're ready or not. There's various examples. I'm just going to share with you sometimes. Some of them I read, I think you might do it and then get diagnosed, get an assessment that says, build your capacity. I would still say no matter where you score on these assessments, that you still ask yourself, do I feel confident And if not, like, what's it going to take to build your capacity? I did not look to see if the states are borrowing each other's tools. I just Googled and I found that there were a number of them. I didn't cross-reference, so you could see, just pick one or two and just do it as a point of reference. And then I provided some specific resources here that I thought would be helpful. If you hover on this thing, once you get the slides, you should be able to link to it. The one on the left of the screen, this is a resource that was created by a national nonprofit called Service Year Alliance. This paper kind of outlines some ways in which programs are engaging in education outcomes and national service. So it talks about lots of different programs and outcomes, and I think it's a good resource. And then the one on the right is a document that was created by the Corporation for National Community Service. In this one, they have provided information. The toolkit was designed, the audience in mind was superintendents and principals and school K through 12 stakeholders mostly. And they are talking about different program models. They cite some models. They try to walk you through the different AmeriCorps programs, that alphabet soup that I talked about, so you could think that through. So I think these are some things that are good, things to read. So that's what I would say, go read these. And then finally, what I said to you earlier is use your network, right? You have connections to Berea, to others. I'm happy to be a point of reference. I just noted here my contact information. I'm happy to be a contact if you have some questions. My current role, I provide coaching and consulting to organizations, but in the interim, I'm happy to answer one or two questions if something comes up, or point you in the right direction. But again, I want to go back to, these are some things that I think are really useful for you, direct action you could take today. If you were really serious about this, or at least setting weekly goals and thinking about it. What I do want to point out, for those of you that are like, I think I'm ready, I just want to point out that the grant process is long. And so even though if you're thinking next school year, right, you want to have AmeriCorps members starting next summer, next fall, the application process is probably going to start this fall, because most of you are going to be applying maybe through your state, in which case they have deadlines that are come as far as early as October or November. Otherwise, they may have some later dates, but I would say to you, start now. And that's why contacting your state service commission is at the top of that list.
So Darryl, you got 2 minutes to talk about action.
I use the words of Carter G. Woodson, the great historian, when he said, when you control the person's thinking, you don't have to worry about their actions. So the first I would say is that I would pose the question to folks who are practitioners and say, is this what you do, or are you a champion for service years? Because depending on how a person answers that, you will decide that the micro or macro work that you do can lead to a young person ending up in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, doing some meaningful work. But if we don't get them in the pipeline, then we won't change our sector. So I think that we have to look at this as just not just one time a year, but this year experience or part-time experience can really make a difference of who we have serving in places and spaces in the years to come. The other piece is, in the crisis that we live in, I hope folks will continue to be creative and think upstream and not downstream. Look at being creative when you think about an AmeriCorps Vista program that could really be, you may not have ever seen it before, but it could be one that you say, hey, in our rural space, this has value. So trust what you know about your space, and then, take the journey to try to make it happen. So that's where I am. I think that because Rosa's lens and journey has been different than mine, I appreciate that she has some pieces in there that help people grasp that piece. I am more the one that, hey folks, let's move this, and that the crisis we're in is going to help us to, it's pushing us to move and think differently about how we get people engaged in their community. So those are my 2 cents.
Yeah, and I think that, you guys have given us a lot to think about. My action steps is follow the legislation and think about what Congress is doing. What can we do as citizens to encourage legislation that actually increases the living stipend for AmeriCorps members, increases the amount of funding for AmeriCorps members. I think this country is going to go into an economic crisis, and I think years of service will be that bridge that will get a lot of our low-income kids through and to the other side. So what can we do just as individuals to support increased funding for CNCS and AmeriCorps, and funding that will allow low-income young people to serve? The other piece is, and this is just what we did as we organizationally were thinking about this, is take the time to talk to folks that are experts in the field, and pull on that. We've invested in folks to help us design programs. We've invested in consultants like Rosa that help us think about how to do this well. That investment at the front end definitely pays off at the back end. So thank you all for doing this. Sam, you have a slide, I think, that has our next date up for our next program. All right, because I can't remember. It's in September. So we'll come back together on September 9th at 11 a.m. And what we're going to really dig into there is the rural college advising. And I think this is a great setup for this, because some of the advising that's really working and happening is through AmeriCorps programs. But we're going to look at the research and also at some best practices on rural college advising and how do we transition our work or build that strong connection virtually. So I appreciate everybody. Darryl, Rosa, thank you guys for joining. Hopefully we can do this again.
Yes, definitely. Best to you all, Rosa, Dreamer, Samantha. Everybody have a good day. Thanks to all.
Right. We'll be putting this online. It'll also be condensed into a podcast that will have an interview with Jacob Seipert. Jacob is currently serving in Arizona in Yuma. And so we had a great interview with Jacob that will also be included in the podcast, and we'll be sending the slides and resource material. So thank you all. If you have additional questions, we'll leave the chat open for a couple of minutes.